I want to start with a question. How many in this room have ever heard of a city called Xi'an? Raise your hands. Xi'an, X-I-A-N. I was there 2 weeks ago, invited by a group of professors and graduate students from the Northwest China University of Xi'an. And 30 years ago, Xi'an was almost a village with no skyscrapers, no automobiles, only bicycles, thousands and thousands of bicycles. Today, in the middle of China, geographical middle of China, Xi'an is a city of 10 million people, traffic jams worse than anything I've ever seen in New York City, unfortunately, but they're doing things to build subways and eliminate some of those snarls. And what that is symptomatic of is what the rest of the world is doing while Europe and North America, especially my home country, the United States, are dying. I'll bring some good news in my comments today, but I want to give you a sense that while the West is destroying and dying and choking in public and private debt, the East, from Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Iran, China, the East is building, 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 building. I was invited to China for the launch of my newest book. It's not yet in English, but the Chinese wanted to bring it out urgently. It's called One Belt, One Road, or the New Eurasian Century. And my basic thesis is the insane wars, the geopolitical wars that were planned over the past decade since the end of the Cold War in 1991-92 have so colossally backfired on the boring old patriarchs, as I call them, the 86-year-old rapidly dying from the pictures you see, George Soros, his good friend David Rockefeller, who's now over 100. There are claims he's had several heart transplants. I don't want to know whose heart was put in that body. And I think to understand, I am both an investigator, a geopolitical investigator, writing contemporary articles, but I start from the premise of an historical method and the premise of economics on a global scale in order to set a framework to understand the world today. And I'd like to do that very briefly, going back to 1939 in order that people have a better grasp of the world we're in today, with wars in Syria, with refugees flooding into Europe, creating chaos everywhere as a consequence of those wars. Who's behind those wars? Wars in Ukraine, and now saber-rattling over some naked islands in the South China Sea by the US Navy and Japan and others. Go back to 1939 and a top-secret project that was carried out in the offices of the building of the New York Council on Foreign Relations. It was a project financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, the foundation based on Standard Oil monies. And it was called the War and Peace Studies. 1939, before Nazi tanks invaded Poland, before the beginning of what was called World War II, which was nothing but the continuation of unresolved issues of World War I. They looked at the map of the world, and their premise was America will emerge from the coming World War. Already in 1939, they said this is going to be a world war. America will emerge as the hegemon, as the supremo. And we should start planning now what kind of a world we will control. So they had American geographers, geopoliticians, like Halford Mackinder of Britain, but an American version, Isaiah Bowman of Johns Hopkins, and historians, cultural experts on all parts of the world. And they said in their deliberations, let us not make the mistake that the British made. We won't call ours an empire, because American people don't feel good thinking they're an empire, that they're imperialists. That's the dirty European colonialists, the Belgian, the Dutch, the British, the French, and so forth. We're these squeaky clean good guy Americans. So what we will do is wrap our empire in the American flag and say this is the export of democracy and freedom, the free enterprise system. Well, that's pretty much what happened at the close of combat in 1945. Europe was a rubble field. Japan had been nuclear bombed, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and was in unconditional surrender. And 70% of the world's central bank monetary gold was sitting in the Federal Reserve. Some of it stolen from governments that no longer survived the war, and some of it sent there for security reasons because of the war. The Germans have yet to get back the full amount of their stored central bank gold from the Federal Reserve. Isn't that interesting? Well, this American century, as Henry Luce of Time magazine called it, he was an insider in these circles, the American century hummed along pretty smoothly. I mean, there was a Korean War that created this kind of permanent national security state and various other things. But for most Americans and most Europeans, these were very calm times, periods of zero inflation almost. The economies were booming because of rebuilding after the war. It wasn't the Marshall Plan money. It was the idea that the US supported the rebuilding of both Japan and Europe and Germany included. Until the end of the 1960s. And at that point, Germany had become an economic giant again in a very short period of time. And de Gaulle in France in 1967-68 instructed his central bank to demand the gold of the Federal Reserve under the Bretton Woods Treaty Agreement that they were required to pay when central banks abroad redeemed American dollars. And they said, we want to take gold. We don't just want dollars. We don't believe the dollar is any more as good as gold. That was in 67, 68, and it led to a crisis, first in the pound sterling, which was tied to the dollar most closely, and in the next several years in the dollar itself, until Nixon in August 1971 ripped up the Bretton Woods Treaty in front of the world and said, do something about it. We don't give gold anymore for your paper dollars. So that was the beginning of the end of this American century in a way that few people understood. And 2 years later, at a meeting of a group that was founded here in Holland at the so-called Bilderberg meeting, 2 years later, in May of 1973, in Stockholm, outside of Stockholm, at the hotel owned by the Wallenberg family, the richest, the Swedish Rockefellers they're known as, the Bilderberg group, including David Rockefeller, including the heads of all the major British and American oil companies, and the leading bankers of Wall Street and London, including the Rothschilds, they discussed a looming 400% increase in the OPEC price of oil. Arab OPEC countries were about, they were told, to increase the price of oil to an amount that worked out to be 400%. Henry Kissinger was among the invited guests as Secretary of State and Security Council head of Nixon. And Henry Kissinger at that time was engaged in the famous Middle East shuttle diplomacy between Damascus and Tel Aviv. In truth, what he was doing was lying to both sides to create the preconditions for what became the Yom Kippur War, and arming unilaterally the Israeli side in that looming diplomatic buildup, such that the king of Saudi Arabia, at that time Faisal, threatened if the United States and Europe, NATO, continued to arm Israel unilaterally, we will have no choice but to declare an oil embargo on you. So that was the aim, that was the point of the Bilderberg discussion, to create a scenario that would lure the Saudis into a trap. Well, you remember the gasoline lines of the 1973-74 period. And then I had the chance in September 2000 to be invited because of the book that Jan mentioned, my book, Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics. I was invited by the then, in the 70s, the Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Zaki Yamani, to his annual energy retreat outside of London at the Penny Park Hotel. And after the retreat, I was told he wanted me to be his guest for dinner at his home and wanted to talk about what I'd written. And we spent a fascinating evening. He is a deeply read person, an intellectual. He had read my book, and he said in his conference, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have invited Professor Engdahl here as the only person who has written the truth about what really happened in 1973 with the oil shock." And I told him about the Saltschubaden meeting. I told him I know that that was the discussion because one of the attendees of the Bilderberg was careless in cleaning out his Paris hotel room, or his secretary, whoever did it, Shepard Stone of the Aspen Institute, and gave away the confidential minutes of that 1973 meeting. And being a certified addicted bibliophile, book addict, I was on the banks of the Seine on a Sunday afternoon looking at open boxes of books at the Shakespeare and Company bookstore. And my eye caught this tiny print, strictly confidential, not for publication. I didn't even know what it was, but of course, you're going to look at that. And I saw a Bilderberg meeting. There were two, actually, 1971 and 1973. So I took them in and asked the owner of Shakespeare and Company, he's now deceased, but I said, what will you take for these? He said, 25 cents each. And I said, okay, I'll take it. And he stamped it with the Shakespeare stamp, so any time you see a picture of that cover in a book by Daniel Estelin or anybody else, and you see the stamp of Shakespeare and Company, you know that they got it from me. Because that was in my Century of War book of reproduction. Well, to bring it briefly, after the abandonment of gold as a dollar exchange system of Bretton Woods in 71, 73, the dollar went on what was called a petrodollar system because Henry Kissinger said we have to recycle all the petrodollars that are flooding the treasuries of Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Shah of Iran was a, not family friend. He was controlled by David Rockefeller and Chase Manhattan Bank, where he put all of the Iranian oil monies. The recycling of the petrodollar saved Wall Street, but it severely damaged the economies of Europe and the United States. However, the people of Wall Street, the people of the Bilderberg and so forth, as many of you know, care not a whit about normal, quote-unquote, people. In fact, they wanted to model themselves on the British Empire after the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. Buy cheap, sell dear. Import cheap food from India, bankrupt British farmers. You don't care about them. They go for salvation into the big dirty cities of London and Manchester and elsewhere to be cheap labor. And So the British Industrial Revolution was built on that. Well, that petrodollar world did not last so long. In 1989, a group of neoconservatives, neocons, in Washington orchestrated something called the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, after 10 years of a covert CIA operation called the Mujahideen War against the Red Soviet Army in Afghanistan. And the opening up of formerly communist countries in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia back in 1989 November opened those countries to one of the most heinous and blatant looting operations, plunder operations in modern history, comparable to the so-called Great Holy Crusades of the 10th, 11th century, 12th century in the Middle East. And Harvard shock therapists like Jeffrey Sachs and their Harvard whiz boys were brought in by George Soros into Poland, into Hungary, into Ukraine, into Russia. At that time, Boris Yeltsin, who more and more evidence points to the fact that he was on artificial life support as well as infinite supply of vodka supplied to him by certain CIA networks. And he did a very nice job. He was told, you can enrich the Yeltsin clan as much as you want, billions, billions, we don't care, as long as they're dollar billions and not ruble. We want you to privatize your central bank on the Federal Reserve model, or the model of the Bank of Netherlands or the German Bundesbank. Privately controlled independent central bank with one mandate written into the Russian Constitution in 1990. The first thing that Yeltsin was ordered to do by the US is that the Central Bank of Russia has only two tasks constitutionally: stabilization of the ruble and control of domestic price inflation. That means, by definition, the ruble is linked to the US dollar. And today, the head of the Russian Central Bank, I've written often about this and I've spoken on Russian television about this. I don't know how well it was translated into Russian, but I think it was. And I spoke at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in June on a panel that was about this economic theme. The head of the Central Bank of Russia is a hardcore conservative Austrian school monetarist who is single-handedly destroying the Russian economy with double-digit interest rates 2.5 years after the imposition of sanctions and long after any danger to the Russian economy. What her motives are, or whether she's simply mentally fixated, I cannot say. But she certainly is not doing any good for Russia. The looting of Eastern Europe, of Russia, to an extent up until 1999, when a nationalist faction of the intelligence community in Russia engineered the rise of a little-known leader by the name of Vladimir Putin, who then became president, and Yeltsin very conveniently disappeared into retirement. And you've had a seesaw battle internally in Russia ever since then between the Medvedev Western liberal-oriented faction and the Putin more nationalistic. Russia has to be able to survive itself because the West is not a friendly face. The West is expanding NATO up to our doorstep. The West is creating provocative, potentially nuclear war-causing missile installations in Poland, in Romania, in Ukraine, in the Czech Republic, and more recently in Turkey, called anti-ballistic missile defense, which is, if you talk to any knowledgeable military expert, they will tell you ballistic missile defense is the most offensive preparation for a nuclear first strike. And Russia knows this. Of course, the Pentagon knows this. They're deliberately doing it. And what do you do if you see your opponent escalating this step by step, year by year since 2007? You begin to think of a preemptive strike before they can do that. The patriarchs, as I call them, who have the neurotic idea they own the world and they own the United States, the American patriarchs, at this point, since 2007, are in the most severe crisis of their history. The American century is in shambles. The financial crisis of 2007, how many of you here also believe that that is behind us and that the United States economy is in a genuine recovery with 5% unemployment? How many? Not too many. Oh. What, you don't believe what Mark Twain said, the daily newspaper? Are you uninformed? Well, private economists that I've known for over 30 years, one of them, John Williams, have made independent assessments relying on adjustments that have been made systematically by every president since Lyndon Johnson to the Labor Department statistics, and he estimates the real unemployment today in America, people who want full-time normal jobs and are unable to find them, is 23% of the labor age population. 23%. Something like 93 million Americans are without work. Not all of them want work, of course, but 93 million is quite many. The economy, because of globalization that really got underway with Bill Clinton, globalization of the economy, the United States industrial heartland has been hollowed out. It's all basically in Asia right now, and to a certain extent in Eastern Europe and Russia, but mostly in China. And I don't call them powers that be, I don't call them elites, because I don't think they're very elite in anything. They're just boring old patriarchs, like David Rockefeller and friends. They have decided to fall back on the only thing that they know has worked for them in the past: war and military spending. So as Europe began with the launching of the euro and those developments, began to assert a little bit of economic independence from being a vassal of Washington, especially the German economy and German industry began to invest heavily in the Russian economy. German-Russian ties go back centuries. The Tsar times, the foreign minister of Russia was a German. The Tsarina, Catherine the Great, was a German. German-born. So, but the natural ties between German industry and Russia go back quite far, and they were booming up until the time that Viktor Yushchenko, the elected president, by the way, of Ukraine in 2013, took two offers that were on his table. One was a very bizarre associate junior Little League membership offer for the European Union with no money and a lot of demands that they liberalize and free marketize their economy even more than they'd done in the past. And the other offer was from Russia to join the Eurasian Economic Union that was then being formed, with Kazakhstan, Belarus. Armenia has since joined it, as Kyrgyzstan has also. And Russia offered a 30% reduction in natural gas prices from Russian gas fields to Ukraine, to the economy. They offered to purchase $10 billion worth of Ukrainian state debt to ease the financial crisis and Yushchenko, not so surprisingly, announced at a meeting, I think it was in Vilnius, in September of that year, 13, that he had decided that the best interest of Ukraine lay with the Russian Economic Union. And immediately, a color revolution Mach 2 was launched in Kiev. It was called Maidan Square, or Euromaidan. And Yatsenyuk, the man who Victoria Nuland handpicked and put into the prime minister's post after the coup d'etat, began a Twitter color revolution in Kiev. They recruited and trained, NATO recruited and trained the CIA, Blackwater, Tsi, whatever name they give themselves nowadays, this paramilitary mercenary organization of the United States that's identical to the CIA in most respects. They trained a group called the Pravi Sector, neo-Nazi thugs who went around Ukraine with baseball bats, beating up people they don't like and forcing them out of their homes. So they were trained in Poland at a secret NATO base and brought into Kiev to be the security for the so-called peaceful protest in Maidan Square. And you all remember, or no doubt read about the intercepted telephone conversation between Victoria Nuland, who came to Kiev in the winter with a plastic bag full of some sandwiches to give to these tens of thousands of protesters. Talk about contempt. And she was in a phone conversation with the local CIA station chief, who's also the American ambassador, Jeff Pyatt. And they were talking, Pyatt was updating her on what the Germans especially, the Poles less so, and the French wanted as a lineup to be in the new government. And Victoria Nuland said to the US ambassador, "Fuck the EU, this is who's going to be in the..." And George Friedman, the founder of Stratfor, which is a spooky intelligence service in Austin, Texas, that has ties to the Pentagon as well as the Mossad, he gave an interview where he said this was the most blatant coup in US history, the coup that put Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk in power along with Pravi Sector in Ukraine, and passed legislation that forced this separatist breakaway in Donetsk, and also the referendum in Crimea to join, or petition to join Russia and not Ukraine. Well, from that point on, demonization of everything Russian down to hacking of emails of the Democratic National Committee, and I don't know, it staggers the imagination, the kind of nonsense that's coming out of mainstream US media blaming Russia nowadays. The coup d'etat in Ukraine is an act of desperation by a desperate group that owns Wall Street, that owns the military industry of the United States and much of Europe. They want to drive a permanent wedge between Europe and Russia through Ukraine. And then in 2010, they began another flank of their war, 2011, excuse me. They launched what Hillary Clinton and others call the Arab Spring, and this was the direct military takeover of the sovereign wealth funds of oil-rich countries in the Middle East, Egypt, Libya, Syria. Ultimately, Iran is on the target list. You heard this morning what Wesley Clark said. And the Arab Spring was a color revolution writ large by the US State Department and by the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA-controlled NGO in Washington that does all of these things. One of the things that came out in Hillary's leaked emails was private correspondence with Sid Blumenthal, her personal lawyer and former Clinton administration official, who had financial interests in Libya, private interests, and he reported to Hillary, this is getting very serious. Gaddafi, together with the president of Tunisia, Ben Ali, and the president of Egypt, Mubarak, are planning to launch a gold-backed dinar currency and to sell Libyan oil only for gold dinars in return, not for dollars. And if this catches fire, the dollar and ultimately the US could be in mortal danger. Well, you have only to look at the YouTube of Hillary Clinton after she was informed as Secretary of State that Gaddafi had been brutally murdered. She laughed in a maniacal laugh and said, "We came, we saw, he died, ha 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 ha." And with that died the most prosperous, stable, peaceful country in the entire Arab Middle East oil world, Libya. It's today in permanent state of civil war, armed bands running through the country. Well, Syria was aimed to be exactly the same thing. The CIA was bringing the jihadists, who, by the way, many of them originally came from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the CIA's Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the late 80s, bringing them into Syria to do the same thing against Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because in 2009, the Emir of Qatar went to Damascus and proposed a Qatar natural gas pipeline from the Persian Gulf through Syria into Turkey and onto the European Union. Bashar al-Assad said, "Thank you, no. We have very good relations, decades long, with Russia and with Gazprom, and we have no interest in your pipeline." A year and a half later, Bashar al-Assad signed an agreement, a memorandum of understanding with the head of the Iraqi government and the head of the Iranian government to build an Iranian natural gas pipeline from the Iranian side, called North Parsfield, of the Persian Gulf, going through Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, onto Lebanon, toward the European Union. So what ensued, the so-called war against genocidalist Bashar al-Assad, is little more than a poorly disguised energy war again. In 1975, at the peak of his official powers, Henry Kissinger is reported to have stated somewhere, I never have been able to document it, but if he didn't, he should have. He said, "If you control oil, you control entire nations. If you control food," keep in mind the word control and what implications that has. Control means regulate the supply. Control food, you control the people. Well, control in the case of food means regulate the quality. And if you control money, you control the entire world. My thesis is that project to control, the food control is, my book, The Seeds of Destruction, describes it in great detail, is the Rockefeller Foundation project to create genetically manipulated organisms and toxic herbicides and pesticides that are mated with those GMO plants, soybeans and cotton and corn, to make us sick, make us weak, make us ill, make us die young, so you don't have any unnecessary payments of people in their retirement years. And the control of money, well, the oil is obvious. The wars of the Middle East, the Arab Spring, are all about permanent US military occupation of the oil fields of the Middle East, including eventually Saudi Arabia is on the horizon. But all of this now has been dramatically slowed down by something that happened in September of last year, when Bashar al-Assad appeared about ready to lose everything because the CIA was funneling arms through Turkey, through networks around Erdogan at that point, Recep Erdogan, the president now of Turkey. And money from Saudi Arabia and Qatar was going to train and arm jihadist terrorists, whether they're the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda in Syria, or the so-called ISIS, Islamic State, which is a joke. This is all Mossad, CIA trained, and partly Turkish military trained networks that were sent in to grab those oil fields, to ethnically cleanse certain parts of northern Iraq and northern Syria, near Mosul and elsewhere. And ultimately, the US is using them as a cat's paw to do the dirty work. And then the plan was that Washington would step in as the guarantor of peace, like they do in so many countries where they guarantee peace. A piece here, a piece there. It's a bankrupt policy. It's not working. Russia accepted the call of Bashar al-Assad, and on a shoestring budget conducted a brilliant military campaign from within Syria at the invitation of the government, the only foreign power that has been invited into Syria by the elected government of Bashar al-Assad. And at this point, Washington is in a great turmoil. They tried a coup d'etat in Turkey beginning in May, when Erdogan realized that he was being lured into a monkey trap by Washington. And instead of having friends with all its neighbors policy that they talked about 10 years before, they had enemies on every side. And they had made enemies of Russia. The tourism revenues that Turkey lost were in the order of $10 billion this year alone. They had made enemies of Syria, which used to be a very important economic trade partner for Turkey. 23% of the Turkish people are Alawite Muslims, as is Bashar al-Assad, an Alawite minority. And he fired Davutoglu, the friend of NATO, who had been prime minister and before that foreign minister, and architect of the Syria war strategy for Erdogan, and began to make rapprochement with two countries, Israel and with Russia. And at that point, it's pretty clear certain networks that the CIA controls since 40 years inside Turkey, a NATO Gladio country since 1952, were activated. There are reports that the former commander of US forces in Afghanistan, General Campbell, was officially, quote unquote, retired in March of this past year, but in reality is sent on a secret mission to Turkey to begin with a bank account of some $2 billion to begin hunting for Turkish generals willing to do a coup d'etat against Erdogan and create a Islamic caliphate under a bizarre, poorly educated chap living in Pennsylvania by the name of Fethullah Gulen. I've written a book on this. If you're interested, much of what I'm talking about today comes out of the research for the book. It's called The Lost Hegemon. And Jan, you'll enjoy the cover. A friend of mine did it, a brilliant job. It's a grayish, fading title, The Lost Hegemon. You have to look twice to read it. And then beside the words is a tattered American flag, almost in shreds, that allegedly was picked up at Ground Zero after 9/11. And the subtitle is Whom the Gods Would Destroy. Of course, that's this ancient Greek saying, they first make mad. And I think that's what we're seeing in the world today, that these patriarchs who literally thought they ruled the world, that they could snap their fingers and people would step in line and salute and click their heels, with the pathetic exception of some few people like Angela Merkel, who clicks her heels every time Obama winks at her, it seems, on the refugee issue and various other things, Russia sanctions. The world is beginning to get bored with these silly wars that they seem to always come up with. And what I started my remarks with, I'll conclude with, China in 2013, President Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan proposed creation of a new economic Silk Road. Xi'an, the city that I was invited to, was the ancient capital of China and the source point of the original Silk Road more than 1,000 years ago. And China is building high-speed rail lines crisscrossing Eurasia. There are plans to build them down to Iran if Turkey continues to be friendly to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, China and Russia mainly. Turkey will become a part of the Silk Road. It will open up regions of Central Asia that have never been open to infrastructure during the Cold War because Russia simply could not afford a civilian economy and a military economy at the same time. So this new Silk Road is also being linked to the question of gold and gold-backed currencies. The Chinese have created a Shanghai Gold Exchange. They're the largest gold miner in the world, larger than South Africa by far. The #2 gold mining country in the world is Russia. And both countries are buying gold like it's going out of business. So I think what we're seeing is an alternative to a bankrupt dollar system, to a bankrupt euro system, and make no bones about it, no matter what the Dutch finance minister says about the stability of the euro. The banks of the European Union and of the Eurozone are brain dead at this point. Deutsche Bank, the premier bank since 1871 of German industry, has been ruined by a bunch of derivative swindlers over the past, since the murder of Herrhausen by the CIA in 1989. And now Deutsche Bank may need to be bailed out by the German government. Europe is being deliberately and systematically destroyed by certain circles who want to end the nation state. They are using the wars in the Middle East as a weapon to create refugee flows into the European Union. Nobody I've talked to in Germany can figure out what happened to Angela Merkel. My own conclusion is the CIA, after the communist youth period of young Angie Merkel, has some pretty devastating dossiers on her that she doesn't want to be made public. And Obama has threatened to do that. Whatever the reason, Germany is being ripped apart. The stability that Germans, having fought and lost 2 world wars in the past century, the one thing that most Germans desperately cling to is the illusion of stability. And that is being systematically destroyed. A source that I indirectly know through my private doctor in Wiesbaden in Germany just retired as a senior German bureaucrat, civil servant in Brussels. And in his capacity in Brussels up until the spring of this year, he was privy to the confidential documents between the Berlin government and the European Commission. He said, at the end of 2015, the Merkel government gave an estimate of the new refugee inflow for 2016, this very year we're in today, of 3.4 million additional after 1.1 million refugees last year. They have classified the budget for these refugees, 40% of them have been tested as completely illiterate, even in the Arabic language, Syrian, North African, whatever. It's a catastrophe. Most of the doctors, lawyers, teachers, nurses that Merkel talked about at the beginning, they're all working in Turkey. The Turkish government has selected them out and let them work in civilian jobs. So what's being released are, and some of the networks that bring them into Europe are run by ISIS. So this is a destabilization. I don't think it's going to last much longer. I think Europeans are revolting against this. And I personally am optimistic about the future because I think truth is out. It's becoming recognized by more and more people. Look at the room here today. It's what, 250 people? Or something of that order on a beautiful sunny September day in Utrecht. And the energy of war is losing everywhere. People are looking for positive answers, and I think the hypnosis that these patriarchs have been able to use, that we are in awe of the power of a Rockefeller or a Rothschild or a George Soros and so. I close with a quote from the new president of the Philippines. He's not a master statesman from his public comments, but the Philippines is a formerly US-occupied colony that asked the Americans to leave some decades ago. Now they're back in military force under the pro-US Aquino government. But Duterte, the new president, is a man of the people, it seems. And when the US ambassador in Manila called him in for shooting drug lords, shoot to kill, Duterte turned to the press and said, "The US ambassador is a gay son of a bitch." Now, that shows a modicum of disrespect for the greatest superpower in the world, it seems to me. The emperor has no clothes, and people like Duterte, who's a rather crude fellow, it seems, are saying that openly, and many, many more people are joining in that sentiment. I'm optimistic. On the US elections, maybe we take that in the discussion period, I would suggest. Thank you.
Kun je hem aanzetten? Hallo? Ja? Kun je hem horen? Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions. There is the one microphone by Yannick. If you have a question, you have to go there. Short questions, no speeches. Yes?
I have a question about Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Brzezinski.
He is of his ancestors are of so-called Polish Szlachta. Do you think he is going to be to re-establish Greater Poland like we did have before?
No. Short question, short answer.
Hi. A few months ago, I stumbled on the internet on a broadcast of an Austrian program called Weltjournal, and it brought something new to me. I'd never heard about. They broadcast it once, it seemed, and it's been put away. It was about an organization in Serbia called Otpor.
Otpor Canvas today is the name, yeah.
Yeah, you also know.
I think I was in that video.
Oh, you were in it, of course, you were in it, of course.
Yes, I recall they came to Passau on the Austrian side of the border to film my comments about the...
Okay, is it still active? Is it still active, Otpor?
Sure.
And what I didn't understand is why it is...
All the color revolutions, it's just an arm of the CIA US State Department, and they launder it through Belgrade. It's called Canvas. But the same people are doing this. They're training people from the Egyptian Tahrir Square, you know, color revolution. They brought them to Belgrade so to get them out of Egypt and then smuggle them into Gene Sharp, the Albert Einstein Institution, which has nothing to do with Einstein.
Okay.
But it sounds good.
And is there anything else behind the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s?
Yes. Yes.
Also
well, the OPOR didn't exist the beginning of the Yugoslav war. In 1989, it was started by George Bush Sr.
Yeah.
And legislation that was passed from the Bush administration by the Congress to dismember Yugoslavia, to make U.S. financial aid conditional on separate autonomous federation states, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and so on. And then they began systematically, they brought the Mujahideen in, Osama bin Laden's recruits from Chechnya, where they came after they went to Azerbaijan, left Afghanistan. They brought them in to Bosnia-Herzegovina to run jihad terrorism, you know, holy terrorism, against the Serbs, and then blame the Serbs for the most of the atrocities. Much of this has been documented. It's in my book, The Lost Hegemon, in some great detail because it's so important and is so buried. I think there was a Dutch researcher who did a brilliant, detailed report on some of this, as I recall.
And was it also about the confiscation of natural resources in the country, or?
I think it was.
I think you have to buy the book.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a good advice.
Yeah, short question. No speeches.
No speeches. Short question. Thank you very much for your survey.
You're welcome.
For your survey, what you told us. Maybe I have 3 details because they are actual today. Can you affirm or deny that baby Biden, that's the nickname for one of the sons of Joey Biden, was parachuted into the highest management level of the Ukraine, is parachuted there of the Ukraine oil company?
Yeah, the son of Biden is on the board of the Ukrainian state natural gas company.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Second,
Aftergas.
We have Libya. You told us about the gold standard and what the United States found as a threat. But I think, could you say something about WikiLeaks? I think that there were negotiations going with Gaddafi, with the oil companies of Mobil, Shell, the French, the Italian, and the Russian, going on because Gaddafi wanted higher royalties. And so also the Dutch government has supported this coup against Gaddafi because Shell was in play. So my question is, can you affirm this WikiLeaks?
All of those companies were involved, and I have no independent confirmation of that, no.
But they were involved. Okay, that's...
They were involved in projects in Libya at the time.
Yes,
including
and there
oil.
were negotiations.
I don't know anything about that,
That's
I'm sorry.
what WikiLeaks says. And then the Syria pipeline war. Isn't Afghanistan also a pipeline war, maybe?
Afghanistan?
Yeah.
Yes and no. The NATO, US, Pentagon wants to get inside the underbelly of Central Asia. And Afghanistan was a convenient way to do that. The same as with the Yugoslav war, the goals shifted in the middle of the war toward Kosovo liberation under a mafia gangster named Taci, supported by the US and trained by the US, to put the largest US military base since the Vietnam War, called Camp Bond Steel in Kosovo.
And Last but not least, I'm very interested in your
I can't hear you terribly well.
Last but not least, I think the audience is interested in your appreciation of what's going on in the United States now between Hillary Clinton and our Trump. I mean, there's a choice, a difficult choice between a real Yankee fascist, that is Clinton, and Trump is a Zionist fascist, in fact. So you're...
That's a pretty good summation of the choice that most Americans are thinking about. It's not the lesser of two evils, it's between evil one and evil two. Hillary is psychopathic. She is ill in a degree that is not being talked about in the mainstream media from a brain concussion in 2012. She's on medications that cause her to have epileptic fits. She has symptoms of dementia. This is madness of the exponential order. Donald Trump, his entire career comes from organized crime, from Roy Cohn in Studio 54 in New York City in the 60s. He's unfit to be president. He has no intellectual qualifications for the job. Well, Ronald Reagan didn't either, many of them. But look at the vice presidents, because the patriarchs seem to run things through their vice presidents. Obama doesn't run things. He delegated Libya rather, to Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State. Joe Biden ran the Ukraine coup with Victoria Nuland, of course, being the front person. And Joe Biden came to Turkey 2 weeks ago to meet with Erdogan and try to make sure Turkey didn't leave NATO, because that would be catastrophic for the United States military agenda in the entire oil-rich Middle East. So,
thank you very much.